All right. Welcome to the sideboard. My name's Eric, and you're watching the State of Standard, a new type of meta coverage that I'm going to be putting out about once per set. Now, the overall view of this coverage is going to be to look at the top strategies that have kind of come and gone throughout the set since the release of Ixalan. Now, we are going to be breaking these down into three categories, those being tier 1, tier 1.5, and tier 2. And I have my own criteria for those tiers, so I do want to explain that before we get started. Now, I like to think about an upcoming event when I like to explain the tiers. If we're thinking about an event that's going to be coming in, let's say, this coming weekend, if you ask a majority of the Magic community what decks they think are going to top 8 that event, they're probably going to give you at least 3 or 4 of the exact same answers. And those are your tier 1 decks. What is tier 1.5? Now, those are what I like to call your upset decks. Those are the decks that there are normally quite a few of, and any one or two of them can kind of slip in, take a spot in the top 8, take a spot in the top 4, even take a tournament from time to time. So these are your tier 1.5 strategies. So what are your tier 2 decks? Now, this is probably my favorite category because the farther down in tiers you get, the broader the spectrum gets and the more decks you have to play with. The tier 2 decks are your free to play decks. These are the decks you would expect to win or at least top 8 your local FNM with. These are the decks that if you put into a league, you will at least 3 and 2 that league so that you can play for free. If you do like the show, give us a thumbs up, and if you like the content in general, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. So before we get started, let's talk about our first honorable mention, and that's Red-White Approach. Red-White Approach is a deck that used Sunbird's Invocation and Approach of the Second Sun as an instant win condition. And the deck did show up in a top 16 finish in a large event early in the format. However, it just really hasn't resurfaced since. So let's look at our second honorable mention here, and that's the Esper Marionette Master. Marionette Master is a really good concept. I like using Tezzeret with the Ethereum tokens and the treasures, sacking treasures. Hidden Stockpile is really good. And we've even seen 4-color variants of this that only splash white for the Hidden Stockpile. So there are some versions of this floating around, and we do see it pop up in the meta from time to time. Someone may put a good version of this deck together. I look forward to that, as the current deck is already a lot of fun. It's just that Marionette Master is a little bit fragile with all of the Abrades, Harness Lightnings, and Lightning Strikes in the meta. So let's talk a little bit about the number 1 strategy, or the tier 1 strategies in Standard. The number 1 strategy in Standard is energy, and to use the energy mechanic to the fullest, you basically need to be playing something along the lines of Teamer Energy. Now, Teamer Energy plays to all of the greatest strengths of the energy mechanic. Even though the mechanic is parasitic, by design, that is exactly how it's supposed to work. Now, I do like the word parasitic when describing energy, because that's kind of exactly how it is. This card will create some energy, this card will create some energy, this card will spend some energy. That is one of the things that makes the stock Teamer Energy extremely powerful, as it typically has a few more energy spenders than some of the other energy builds. Now, we have seen more variants of the Teamer Energy deck pop up. Let's take a look at Yuya Watanabe's list from the Japanese Nationals this year. Now, he ran 4 copies of Vizier Mini Faces, and he still ran the Confiscation Coups. With Sky Veraska and Chandra in the main board, he built it to be a little bit more like Control. And then when you get to looking at the sideboard and see the copy of Nissa, Steward of Elements, and even a copy of Nicol Bolas God Pharaoh, you start to see just how controlling he went with his build. So that's one version that you can take with Teamer. You can go the mid-range, you can go into more of a planeswalker control version of the deck. I mean, at this point, the Scarab God's almost an honorary planeswalker, but there are other ways you can take the deck as well. So let's take a look at Larson's list here. Now, Larson is actually playing a version of Teamer that I like to call Teamer Black. It's not just 4-color Teamer that has just barely splashed into black. No, this deck has double black spells main deck. So the deck is definitely on black mana, and it makes a lot of good use out of that using 4 copies of Fatal Push. Now, one of the most interesting parts about this deck was his use of Glint Sleeve Siphoner. Teamer Energy is not typically seen with Glint Sleeve Siphoner until Larson came up with this list, and he also included 3 copies of Gonti in his main board. Now, one of the main reasons for this is because this was a deck that was kind of built to defeat other Teamer decks. The Gontis pulling out of the top 4 cards of your opponent's library when your opponent has a high-powered deck like Teamer Energy, you're sure to find a card that is going to be impactful. That is your #1 strategy in Standard. If there was any deck in Standard that could possibly dispute Teamer, it would be Mono Red. And this is probably your second best deck in Standard. And there are a couple versions of it, and both play really, really well. Now, a few adaptations to Mono Red since Ixalan started was we did get the Lightning Strikes, which really, really helped the deck out, really, really solidified its place in Standard. Now, Mono Red did get a couple new pickups that did help it fight the meta, and that is Rampaging Ferocidon as the major pickup. And then, of course, the Lightning Strike does help out a lot. The newest evolution of the deck has been the additional inclusion of a few extra lands other than just the Ramunap Ruins and the Sun-Scorched Deserts. Lately, we've been seeing versions of Dunes of the Dead, and it makes sense. Even so much so that the deck evolved again into Desert Red, or the deck we currently know as Desert Red, which is probably the real Ramunap Red, considering it runs a lot more deserts than the others. This deck has a few scavenger grounds in it, Sun-Scorched Ramunap Ruins, Dunes of the Dead, and I've even seen a Hostile Desert in these decks. Granted, the deck does play a little bit different, as it has a lot more high-end drops, which are typical in the Ramunap Red sideboard, which normally competes with Hazoret. And for that, this strategy has actually reduced their main board count of Hazoret down to 1, putting a few extra copies in the sideboard for when that strategy is more prevalent, and adding Sand Strangler. The major thing about Sand Strangler is it just ends Whirler Virtuosos all day long. Play this, you automatically remove a creature from their side of the battlefield. Now, granted, it doesn't have haste, but it does fit into the deck very, very nicely. And a 3/3 is quite a good body. So the deck is a little bit different than your typical Ramunap Red deck, and it is built to go farther into the late game. The next strategy I would like to talk about is the control strategy. And I am going to kind of cop out on this one because I'm going to lump 2 decks that are absolutely nothing like each other into the exact same part of this tier. As we have 2 really good tier 1 control decks in Standard. The first one, Approach of the Second Sun, the blue-white Approach of the Second Sun deck. The second one is the blue-black control deck that Tomiko won US Nationals with. The blue-black control deck has since evolved into a few other decks. This deck kind of split. One of those splits was it merged into the Approach deck that has an outrageous game 1 win percentage. The win percentage for blue-black control was not quite so good, as the deck had a lot of dead cards in the main board. The win percentage for blue-white control has been merged with the answers from the blue-black control deck to give us this Esper version of approach. This deck does actually have a main board creature and a transformational sideboard. It is basic typical blue-white approach deck that has 4 copies of Fatal Push in the main board. And Esper has a terrific mana base, and it's a really good strategy. So honestly, if you're a Spike and you want to play mid-range, you're going to be playing Teamer. If you're a Spike and you want to be playing aggro, you're going to be playing red deck. And if you want to be playing control, one of these three, blue, white, UB, or the Esper version of control is probably where you want to sit. I personally think the Esper version gives you the most options and is probably the most versatile in an unknown environment. Let's move on into the last deck in the tier 1 strategy. That is going to be your Golgari counters strategy. The Jessups brought us Sultai Energy, which used some of the early workings of the Golgari strategy, and I'm only going to cover the Golgari version of it because it was the predecessor that later evolved into a Pro Tour winning deck. Now, this is just your Winding Constrictor, Long Tusk Cub, energy package with Glint Sleeves, Rishkars. However, the deck started splashing blue for Rogue Refiners and the Scarab God. And then along comes the Jessups, and they create a monster here in Sultai Energy with the Scarab God, Hostage Taker, mainboard Vraska's Contempts, and steal that Winding Constrictor, Long Tusk Cub, Glint Sleeve Siphoner, Rishkar package, and then a sideboard that can deal with most of the format. Now, this is not the list. This is actually Seth Manfield's list from Pro Tour Ixalan, where he won Pro Tour with it. This is probably your last strategy in the Tier 1 section. Granted, there are a lot of blue-white decks, but I don't necessarily think that those blue-white decks are anywhere in the Tier 1 strategy. And I personally think your only options for Tier 1 are going to be the Teamer strategy in any of its variants, the Sultai strategy in a few of its variants. There's not a lot of variants to Sultai. And then you're going to have those control decks, and that's pretty much all of Tier 1. Let's move straight on into Tier 1.5. And this is where we get another one of those variations. Remember when I was talking about blue-black control and how blue-black control merged into or evolved into a couple other decks? Well, this is the blue-black mid-range deck. This deck does play an awful lot like the blue-black control deck. It is really trying to just slam a Scarab God on turn 5 and pray that it gets to untap, because it does have a plethora of good counter spells, and it has some really good creatures in the graveyard that it can do some real good shenanigans with. And transformational sideboard. The sideboard here allows the deck to really compete against pretty much anything in the format, and because the deck can actually put some bodies down, the deck can actually get into these board stalls or board states where River's Rebuke is 100% necessary. Now, also because it is blue-black, remember, you cannot deal with an enchantment, so River's Rebuke is another way to remove all of those enchantments and put things back in their hand. The blue-black mid-range didn't stop there with the evolution. We started seeing people put pirates and things like that into it, as the pirates had some really good counter spells, and most of the blue-black deck, the Pirate God or other pirate decks are very, very good, and they are those decks that can kind of sneak in. But it wasn't until the latest version or the latest transformation of the blue-black mid-range that really started to excite me, where this deck actually started more and more of the blue and started picking up some of the red hints from Teamer Energy. You could say this is almost a Teamer Energy deck that has just decided to drop green altogether. We have our blue Rogue Refiner, if you will, that doesn't produce energy, but it does allow us to dig a little bit deeper into our library. I really like this strategy, as It allows you to put some really powerful threats down, and the Scarab God doesn't necessarily have to be one of them. You do have Chandra Torch of Defiance, 4 copies of Glorybringer, and then you have Answers for Days. But one of the real all-stars in a deck like this is Glint Sleeve Siphoner. The deck is full of a lot of answers, and playing Glint Sleeve just helps you really pull through and get the cards you need to get the job done. By the way, did I mention that other than Esper, this is one of the best land bases you can put together in Standard right now? I really think that this is just one of the most supreme land bases that you can have, is being in Grixis or being in Esper. Being in red in general gave the blue-black mid-range deck exactly what it needed to push forward. I definitely like the Grixis version. I think it did develop from people playing the blue-black mid-range deck, and I like the deck and will probably be playing this a lot in the near future. So let's take a look at the next strategy here. Now, this strategy has definitely transformed a lot from what we originally knew it as. This is your Heart of Kiran deck, your Mardu vehicles. What was once the menace of Standard, at times we have seen Standard begging for this deck to come back and give us a little bit of a break from Temur Energy. Now, it did do that for a little while, but the deck started morphing and evolving into other decks as more and more people started to play with Heart of Kiran and Aether Sphere Harvester for the vehicles, and you started moving from the Mardu vehicles deck into something that was a little more like red-black aggro. Now, there are a lot of different versions. I've seen red-black aggro that was mainly red. I've seen red-black aggro that was mainly black. If you look at Andrew Jessup's list from this past weekend, he come in 3rd place with a mono black aggro deck in SEG Roanoke, and he come in 3rd. It was either 3rd or 4th. I think they listed as 3rd through 4th, but he came in that spot, made it into the semifinals there with a mono black aggro deck that looks identical to this one. The only red card in the entire deck was a singleton copy of Chandra's Defeat, and I thought that was extremely hilarious, but I do remember that when playing this deck, if they could land a Chandra, if they could land a Glorybringer, there was oftentimes not an overwhelming amount that I could do about it. Now, one of the cards that I didn't like see removed from this deck was Bone Picker, as I thought that the deck played Bone Picker extremely well. Lately, we've been seeing a lot more Magma Sprays, and Magma Spray does deal with Bone Picker awfully well. So let's take a look at the next deck on our list. That is the Esper God Pharaoh's Gift. Now, originally, when the format was young, we were playing God Pharaoh's Gift with Gate to the Afterlife, and we were playing around with, trying to put a bunch of creatures into the graveyard so that we could get back the Angel of Invention. Now, it wasn't until Pascal Maynard took this to a 2nd place finish at the Pro Tour that people really started giving this deck a lot of respect. Now, the deck is extremely powerful. That's why it's at really high on the top of the 1.5 list. And we did see a lot of the deck at the World Cup. However, the World Cup was played with unified team standard. There was a lot of restrictions there. Couldn't allow those teams to play just whatever deck they wanted. Now, most of the teams either took this deck or the Drakehaven Cycling deck. The Drakehaven Cycling deck is a deck that I actually wanted to cover a little bit earlier, as it probably fits a little bit higher on the list than anything else. I actually have it listed here as my 5.5 deck. It is extremely high, and it could possibly be a tier 1.5 strategy, but during the World Cup, most people actually chose to play the Drakehaven deck over the God Pharaoh's Gift deck. Now, what made the blue-white God Pharaoh's Gift deck special was it dropped the Gate to the Afterlife, and it started playing with Refurbish. So the deck actually runs 4 God Pharaoh's Gift, and the major strategy is to just pitch a God Pharaoh's Gift in the graveyard and refurbish it back on turn 4. If you did manage to pitch a couple good creatures, like maybe an Angel of Invention or a Champion of Wits, then you're pretty much golden at that point if you get to refurbish back your God Pharaoh's Gift on turn 4. A 6/6 Achroma is pretty good. It's pretty good. Just gonna say that's pretty good and normally wins most games. Now, we did see one more evolution of the deck, and it did 5-0, and I played the deck, and that is the Sultai God Pharaoh's Gift deck. I don't necessarily think that the deck is extremely powerful, and it might just be one of those decks that snuck in and got a 5-0 finish, but I did want to mention it as it was a deck that went back to the gate to the afterlife, so we may see a little bit more evolution with God Pharaoh's Gift, as the card itself is extremely powerful and we have a couple ways to our disposal to cheat it into play. So I'm not going to say that gate to the afterlife is gone, and I do want to point it out because it means that we might open up a few new color combinations for our God Pharaoh's Gift deck. And another key creature that was added to the God Pharaoh's Gift deck here in Sultai was Multiform Wonder. So if we do see another version of God Pharaoh's Gift deck that can produce some energy, we might see a little bit more of the Multiform Wonder, as it played really well in the deck. Now, moving on, we're going to talk about strategies that is literally going over top of the format. Now, that is your Thopters and your Artificer strategy. Now, this strategy was really brought to light by Craig Wesco, as he played a version of this deck into a 5-0 finish just before the Pro Tour, and if you listen to the stories, kind of set some of the pros on edge, as they were worried as if he were playing it or not, because the deck is extremely strong, and there were a few people that tested it and did not like their matchup versus the deck. Now, Craig Wesco's version is a little different than most, as he jammed a few free jam regents in the deck, and he does run 4 mainboard glory bringers, so the deck has some high end. Overall, the deck is meant to be a improvised deck that is allowed to just throw down a tremendous amount of creatures thanks to Whirler Virtuoso, and it can draw a lot of cards off of cards like Bomat Courier, and the deck's just extremely powerful. Most of the cards in the deck produce massive amounts of power. But after playing this deck, and after this deck 5-0'd, we started seeing a lot of new versions of Thopters and Whirler Virtuoso decks start to pop up. And then we found the Infinite Thopter deck that came into the format and took a lot of people by surprise. They weren't actually expecting Infinite Thopters to be competitive at all, but it seems that something was lost in the rotation, and now this is a viable strategy, and it has been not necessarily dominating standard, but it has been extremely prevalent, as people really seem to like the strategy. And I'm sure you're going to run into a Whirler Virtuoso decoction module deck while you're in Ixalan standard. There has been a version of the deck that came out called Blue Red Modules, and I personally called the deck Module Tron, but it uses all 3 versions of the modules from Kaladesh: the animation module, the decoction module, and the fabrication module, all to create a value type combo with Whirler Virtuoso that just kind of goes off. Now, this deck also had a singleton copy of Gonti's Aetherheart, which worked really well with the decoction modules, and because the deck has Whirl of Inventions, it can go get that singleton copy. The deck was extremely powerful, and it did 5-0 a finish just like every deck on this list, and I really like the deck. I haven't had an extreme amount of luck with this particular version. I personally think that the Blue Red Artificers is a much more powerful version. However, the version that I have just recently played from dev over at SBMTG honestly should have been on this list. It felt absolutely terrific and was kind of a nice joining of the two decks here with the blue-red Artificers and the Grixis Thopters with the decoction modules. I really liked where he was going with that deck, and it is an extremely powerful deck. Let's talk about one of the last strategies I've got for you today, and that's tokens. I've put this at the very end for a particular reason, as this is our most hated out deck in the format. Tokens deck is a deck that basically is based around Hidden Stockpile and Anointed Procession. Now, even though this is one of the best revolt decks in standard, and the deck runs for Fatal Push, it runs Hidden Stockpile, so it can make use out of that great revolt synergy, the deck just got hated out by Rampaging Ferocidon. When the number 2 deck in the format runs 4 cards that are normally reserved as sideboard cards for your deck, and those cards are main board in the number 2 deck in the format, you are being hated out. Zombies got hated out by Pillar of Flame in Innistrad for a long time, and then finally there was an answer to that. But for the most part, as long as Rampaging Ferocidon is seeing mainboard play, the tokens variants, whether it is Abzan tokens, or if it is the Esper tokens, or if it's the new 4-color tokens that is both Abzan and Esper, either way, as long as Rampaging Ferocidon's main board in the format, we're not going to get a lot out of tokens. So that is all of the decks that I have for you guys today. This has been the state of standard. I really think that we have a lot to play with, and we don't necessarily have a stale meta as long as we're not trying to play extremely competitive Magic. On a competitive level, yes, you're going to be playing Red Deck and Temur Energy, maybe one of the control decks, possibly even the cycling deck. I do want to touch on Drakehaven one more time here before I finish, and that is that the deck is extremely powerful in the fact that once it gains control of the game, there are only a few cards in the meta that could even wrestle control of the game back. Most of those are going to be something along the lines of River's Rebuke or another card that will actually probably be impossible for you to resolve against the Drakehaven deck, especially if they get their Abandoned Sarcophagus down. So that is our show for today. I hope you enjoy the show. My name's Eric. Well, that's going to do it for the show today, guys. I hope you have a lot of fun playing all of these different strategies, and I hope that you can take down your tournaments. I've had a lot of fun today. I hope you have fun. We'll see you next time here on the sideboard.